I found myself in a trap. The door was locked. I was chased and I was seduced and I was put in a position that I was just terrified.
Millions of Star Trek fans remember the day Janice Rand suddenly vanished from the bridge of the USS Enterprise. Most assumed she had simply been written out of the show, but the truth was far darker. Behind Grace Lee Whitney's smiling face was a secret she would keep hidden for more than 30 years. Then there's the story of her shocking fall from Hollywood stardom, addiction, homelessness, and a battle for survival that nearly cost her everything. Today, we'll unveil the secret life of Grace Lee Whitney, or as we know her, Janice Rand from Star Trek. But to make sense of it all, let's start from the very beginning. The Star Trek star who vanished overnight. In 1966, a young woman with a neatly styled blonde hairstyle stepped onto the bridge of the USS Enterprise, carrying a clipboard instead of a phaser. Her name was Yeoman Janice Rand, and although she wasn't the captain, the science officer, or the chief medical officer, she immediately stood out. NBC had already featured actress Grace Lee Whitney heavily in promotional photographs before Star Trek even premiered, presenting her as one of the show's central stars alongside William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. Behind the scenes, creator Gene Roddenberry had even bigger plans. Rand was intended to become Captain James T. Kirk's trusted confidant, emotional sounding board, and perhaps the closest thing the famously independent captain would ever have to a lasting romantic interest. Everything pointed toward Grace Lee Whitney becoming one of television's next breakout stars. Then, almost as suddenly as she arrived, she disappeared. By the end of the first season, Janice Rand had appeared in only 8 aired episodes, despite filming additional appearances. On screen, she was Captain Kirk's personal yeoman and thus handled everything from schedules and reports to confidential briefings. But Gene Roddenberry envisioned something even bigger. Rand was meant to humanize Kirk, serving as a steady emotional presence for a captain who constantly carried the weight of impossible decisions. Their relationship was intentionally written with romantic tension. But unlike Kirk's many one-episode romances, Rand was supposed to be the person who remained by his side week after week. In many ways, she was designed to become the emotional heart of the Enterprise. That plan never had the chance to develop. There was no dramatic farewell, no explanation aboard the Enterprise, and no satisfying conclusion to the storyline Roddenberry had begun building. Instead, the subtle connection between Kirk and Rand simply stopped, leaving fans wondering why one of the show's most recognizable early characters had vanished almost overnight. Decades later, many Star Trek historians would argue that removing Rand fundamentally changed Kirk's character, forcing later writers to tell his emotional stories through guest stars instead of a trusted companion who had always been there. Fans immediately noticed the absence. Many cast members later admitted they had been just as surprised. So, what happened to Janice Rand? The official explanation sounded almost routine. Producers had decided the cast was too large. Some recurring characters needed to be reduced. It seemed like another ordinary television production decision, until Grace Lee Whitney finally told her side of the story. Well, at least part of it. The big reveal and the secret Grace Lee Whitney took to her grave. To millions of Star Trek fans, she was simply Yeoman Janice Rand, the loyal assistant who mysteriously vanished from the bridge of the USS Enterprise during the first season. Rumors about her departure spread almost immediately. Some blamed network executives, while others claimed the show's producers wanted Captain Kirk free to pursue a different love interest every week. Those explanations seemed believable enough, and for decades they became accepted as the official story. But in 1998, Whitney published her autobiography, The Longest Trek: My Tour of the Galaxy, and revealed a devastating truth she had kept hidden throughout most of her career. According to Whitney, while she was working on Star Trek, she had been assaulted by a powerful studio executive. However, Whitney never publicly identified the executive. She refused to name him in interviews, convention appearances, or her memoir, even after the entertainment industry became more willing to discuss abuse by powerful figures. That silence has fueled decades of speculation among fans, with countless names suggested, but no credible evidence has ever identified the man. Whitney herself seemed more interested in describing the emotional scars than exposing the perpetrator. She wrote that the assault shattered her confidence and left her questioning whether she even belonged in Hollywood anymore. The timing only deepened the trauma. Just days after the assault, she was informed that Janice Rand was being written out of Star Trek. You see, at the time, television productions operated with little transparency, and actresses had virtually no protection against powerful executives. Star Trek itself was under enormous pressure during its first season, battling budget concerns, network demands, and constant script revisions. Whitney watched her screen time gradually shrink before learning her contract would not continue. From her perspective, everything pointed toward retaliation. For decades, she privately carried the belief that rejecting or upsetting a powerful executive had cost her the role she believed would define her career. It became one of the deepest emotional wounds she ever described, and she spoke openly about how the loss of Star Trek haunted her for years afterward. Then, the story took an unexpected turn. After overcoming alcoholism and rebuilding her life through Alcoholics Anonymous, Whitney returned to Paramount Pictures as part of the amends process encouraged by the recovery program. During those years, she reconnected with Gene Roddenberry and other people involved with the original production. Ironically, Gene Roddenberry would later admit that removing Janice Rand had been a mistake. He repeatedly expressed regret over writing Whitney's character out of the series. Early production notes reveal that Rand had originally been intended as far more than Captain Kirk's secretary. She was envisioned as his trusted confidant, someone who could humanize the captain without overshadowing him. Once Whitney left, many of those quieter emotional moments were reassigned to other characters. This subtly changed the chemistry of the Enterprise crew forever. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't losing Star Trek at all. But before we move on to that part of her secret life, let's see what preceded this episode. Before Star Trek, she had already conquered Hollywood. Long before she ever put on a Starfleet uniform, Grace Lee Whitney had already spent nearly 2 decades proving she belonged in show business. To audiences who first met her as yeoman Janice Rand, it might seem as though Star Trek launched her career. In reality, the opposite was true. By the time she stepped onto the bridge of the USS Enterprise in 1966, Whitney had already shared stages with legendary musicians, appeared in hit Broadway productions, worked alongside some of Hollywood's biggest stars, and accumulated well over 100 television appearances. She was born Mary Ann Chase on April 1, 1930, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but her life changed almost immediately. As an infant, she was adopted by the Whitney family, who renamed her Grace Elaine Whitney, giving her the name that millions of television viewers would later recognize. Even as a child, she showed an unusual gift for performing. At just 14 years old, while most teenagers were worrying about homework and school dances, Grace was already earning money as a professional singer on Detroit's WJR radio station, one of the Midwest's most influential broadcasters. Her talent quickly became impossible to ignore. Before long, she was performing in clubs. Those early years placed Whitney alongside remarkable company. She opened for jazz legend Billie Holiday, whose haunting voice had already transformed American music, and she toured with bandleaders Spike Jones and Fred Waring, 2 of the biggest names in popular entertainment during the era. For a teenager from Michigan, it was an extraordinary education in show business. Night after night, she watched seasoned performers command audiences, adapt to difficult crowds, and survive the relentless pace of touring. It was a demanding environment, but it prepared Whitney for Hollywood better than any acting school ever could. The next breakthrough came on Broadway. Whitney joined the cast of the musical comedy Top Banana, starring the wildly popular comedian Phil Silvers. The production became a hit, and when Hollywood adapted it into a feature film in 1954, Whitney made the transition with it. Her momentum continued as she took over the starring role of Lucy Brown in the national touring production of The Threepenny Opera, replacing none other than B. Arthur, who would later become famous in Maude and The Golden Girls. It was another sign that Whitney was being trusted with roles previously held by major performers. Casting directors already viewed her as a reliable professional capable of handling demanding productions. Hollywood soon followed. Whitney appeared in a string of films, often in supporting roles that audiences remembered even if they didn't immediately recognize her name. One of the most famous was Billy Wilder's classic comedy Some Like It Hot, released in 1959, starring Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis, and Jack Lemmon. Whitney played one of the musicians in the all-female band that unknowingly became the hiding place for Curtis and Lemmon's cross-dressing fugitives. She reunited with Wilder a few years later in Irma la Douce, once again proving she could earn roles in productions directed by one of Hollywood's greatest filmmakers. Looking back, it's remarkable how often Whitney found herself working on projects that would later become cinema classics. Television, however, became the place where Whitney truly thrived. During the 1950s and early 1960s, she became one of the busiest character actresses in the industry. She appeared in more than 100 television productions, including popular series such as Gunsmoke, The Untouchables, Batman, The Outer Limits, and numerous live variety shows hosted by stars like Red Skelton, Jimmy Durante, and Ernie Kovacs. In an era when television was rapidly becoming America's favorite form of entertainment, Whitney had quietly built an impressive resume that few viewers ever realized belonged to the same actress. She wasn't famous yet, but inside Hollywood, she had earned a reputation as dependable, versatile, and remarkably hardworking. That reputation is exactly why Gene Roddenberry noticed her. When he began assembling the cast for his ambitious science fiction series, he wasn't searching for inexperienced newcomers. He wanted performers who could handle demanding scripts, fast production schedules, and the uncertainty of a television concept unlike anything audiences had seen before. Whitney checked every box. She had years of experience, natural charisma, and a warmth that perfectly suited Janice Rand. Everything suggested she had finally found the role that would make her a household name. Instead, Grace Lee Whitney's career was about to come crashing down. What happened next would alter the course of her life, forever. Hollywood and TV fame nearly killed her. Whitney would later admit that alcohol had entered her life before she ever stepped onto the bridge of the USS Enterprise. By the time Janice Rand disappeared from television screens, she was already fighting an addiction that was quietly tightening its grip. Losing the show, she later acknowledged, removed the last piece of stability she had left. Suddenly unemployed, emotionally devastated, and still carrying the trauma of her assault, Whitney found herself drifting into a Hollywood culture where pills and alcohol were practically expected. During the 1950s and 1960s, many entertainers relied on stimulants, sleeping pills, and alcohol simply to survive demanding filming schedules. One of the most notorious figures was Dr. Max Jacobson, better known as Dr. Feelgood. Operating from New York, Jacobson became famous for administering vitamin injections that secretly contained powerful amphetamines. His client list included President John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, Mickey Mantle, and numerous actors, musicians, and public figures desperate for more energy. Whitney later admitted she became part of that same culture, receiving stimulant injections that kept her working even as they quietly fueled a growing dependency. At the time, many performers believed these injections were harmless. Years later, investigators and medical experts would conclude they had helped normalize widespread prescription substances abuse throughout the entertainment industry. For Whitney, pills soon became only part of the problem. Alcohol gradually took over her life as well. She later admitted that after Star Trek, she increasingly relied on drinking to numb both professional disappointment and personal trauma. As jobs became harder to find, the drinking intensified. Casting directors who had once viewed her as a dependable actress began seeing someone struggling to stay in control. Friends drifted away, opportunities disappeared, and Hollywood moved on to younger faces. Whitney would later describe this period with remarkable honesty, refusing to blame producers, executives, or even the industry alone. She acknowledged that addiction had become the force making one bad decision after another. Eventually, the collapse reached a point few people associated with a television actress. Whitney later revealed that she experienced periods of homelessness in Los Angeles. She ended up on the infamous streets of Skid Row, an area already known for concentrated poverty, addiction, and mental illness. The former TV star would later describe herself wandering around the intersection of 6th Street and Main Street, one of the district's most recognizable crossroads, unsure where she would sleep or how she would find her next meal. It was an astonishing fall. Just a few years earlier, she had been appearing alongside William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy on one of television's most ambitious productions. Now, according to her own account, she was another anonymous face trying to survive one more day in one of America's harshest urban environments. Then came another unimaginable tragedy. Whitney later recounted that during her years on Skid Row, she was violently assaulted by a group of men who beat her and left her for dead. Like the earlier assault she suffered during her Star Trek years, this attack became another defining trauma she carried for the rest of her life. This was one of the darkest moments she ever endured. Looking back, she often spoke less about the physical injuries than about the emotional realization that her life had reached a point where she genuinely believed no one would notice if she disappeared forever. By then, Grace Lee Whitney's Hollywood career had almost completely vanished. She saw no realistic path back to acting, or even back to a normal life. Yet this would not become the ending of Grace Lee Whitney's story. The man who helped save her life. At her lowest point, Grace Lee Whitney believed her story was over. The actress who had once stood beside Captain Kirk on the bridge of the USS Enterprise had lost her career, her confidence, and almost her life. Addiction had consumed everything she had spent decades building. Friends had disappeared, Hollywood had moved on, and the future seemed impossible to imagine. Yet, in one of the most remarkable twists in her story, help came from someone millions of fans already admired, not as a fictional Vulcan, but as a deeply compassionate human being. While many professional relationships faded after Star Trek, Leonard Nimoy never completely disappeared from Grace Lee Whitney's life. Long before conversations about mental health and addiction became common in Hollywood, Nimoy quietly reached out to a friend who desperately needed someone to believe she could still be saved. Whitney would later say that Nimoy played a crucial role in encouraging her to seek help through Alcoholics Anonymous. Although Nimoy rarely discussed these moments publicly, Whitney consistently credited him in interviews, convention appearances, and her autobiography. Whitney had reached the stage where addiction convinces people they are beyond saving. She later admitted she had become convinced that she would die as an alcoholic. Instead, someone she had once worked beside on a television set quietly reminded her that another future was still possible. Recovery, however, did not happen overnight. Whitney often explained that sobriety required far more than simply putting down a bottle. Through Alcoholics Anonymous, she confronted years of unresolved trauma, including the assault she endured while working in Hollywood, the devastating loss of Star Trek, and the destructive decisions she had made during addiction. She embraced the 12 steps, including the difficult process of making amends wherever possible. One of those steps eventually led her back to Paramount Pictures, where she reconnected with Gene Roddenberry and others associated with the original series. Those conversations helped her find closure regarding Janice Rand's departure, allowing her to release a burden she had carried for decades. Faith also became central to her transformation. Whitney became a born-again Christian, frequently speaking about how both her spiritual beliefs and the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous worked together in her recovery. She never portrayed religion as a replacement for treatment or fellowship. Instead, she described it as another source of strength that helped her rebuild a life grounded in honesty, humility, and service. Those themes would define the rest of her career far more than acting ever had. Rather than chasing celebrity status again, Whitney increasingly devoted her time to speaking with people struggling through addiction, abuse, and hopelessness. She understood those emotions firsthand because she had lived them. As Whitney's life stabilized, she became a respected voice within recovery communities. She spoke at Alcoholics Anonymous gatherings, churches, rehabilitation programs, and science fiction conventions, often weaving together stories from Star Trek with deeply personal reflections about addiction. Fans who expected behind-the-scenes television anecdotes instead found themselves listening to conversations about survival, forgiveness, and resilience. Whitney later moved to Coarsegold, California, where she continued volunteer work throughout Fresno and Madera counties. Ironically, sobriety also reopened the door that addiction had slammed shut. The comeback no one saw coming. While Grace Lee Whitney was quietly rebuilding her life through Alcoholics Anonymous, Gene Roddenberry was beginning to publicly admit something few Star Trek fans expected. Throughout the late 1970s, as interest in the canceled series exploded through syndication and fan conventions, Roddenberry repeatedly acknowledged that removing Janice Rand had been a creative mistake. In interviews collected in The Best of Trek, and later while promoting Star Trek: The Motion Picture, he explained that NBC executives had wanted Captain Kirk to remain romantically unattached, so writers could pair him with a different woman almost every week. Looking back, Roddenberry admitted he should have resisted that pressure. He realized Rand wasn't limiting the stories. She would have strengthened them. As he later told Whitney, "The biggest mistake I ever made was writing Janice Rand out of Star Trek." He even joked that every time Kirk returned from another interstellar romance, he should have had to face Rand waiting aboard the Enterprise. "What a great plot thickener that would have been," he said. Meanwhile, Whitney's own life was moving in a different direction. After years of addiction, homelessness, and recovery, she wasn't trying to reclaim her television career. Sobriety had become her priority. Through Alcoholics Anonymous, she began making amends with people from her past, eventually contacting Susan Sackett, Roddenberry's longtime assistant, after discovering that one of the most common questions fans still asked at conventions was, "Whatever happened to Grace Lee Whitney?" Sackett invited her to Paramount, where she nervously waited to see Roddenberry for the first time in years. Instead of resentment, she found warmth. Roddenberry greeted her with a hug, apologized for letting Janice Rand go, and spoke enthusiastically about bringing the character back. The conversation also forced Whitney to reconsider one belief she had carried for decades. In her autobiography, she explained that because the assault by a powerful studio executive and her dismissal from Star Trek happened only days apart, she had always linked them in her mind. As she wrote, there had always been a clear cause and effect linkage. But after reconnecting with Roddenberry, she came to believe that Janice Rand had likely been scheduled to leave the series before the assault occurred. Production records and later accounts support the idea that network executives had already decided to reduce the regular cast and eliminate Rand's ongoing romantic tension with Kirk. That realization didn't make the assault any less horrific, nor did it erase the emotional damage caused by losing the role she loved at the exact moment she needed stability the most. If anything, the timing made the experience even more devastating. Within the space of a few days, Whitney endured a traumatic assault, watched her dream role disappear, and entered the darkest chapter of her life. For Whitney, understanding that distinction ultimately became liberating. She later said that discovering her dismissal had probably not been retaliation, changed my whole life, because it allowed her to release a resentment she had carried against the production for decades. She never minimized what had happened to her, and she never publicly identified the executive who assaulted her. But she no longer believed Gene Roddenberry had knowingly abandoned her because of it. That realization transformed one of the most painful relationships in her life into one of forgiveness, eventually leading to her return to the Star Trek family. Her second chance arrived on December 7, 1979. When Star Trek: The Motion Picture finally reached theaters after years of fan campaigning, and syndication had transformed the canceled television series into a worldwide phenomenon. Among the familiar faces returning to the Enterprise was Grace Lee Whitney, once again portraying Janice Rand. It was a moment few people would have predicted during her years on Skid Row. The character, who had vanished without explanation after only 8 aired episodes, suddenly reappeared on the big screen as though she had always belonged there. That second chance arrived on December 7, 1979, when Star Trek: The Motion Picture finally reached theaters after years of fan campaigning, and the success of syndication had transformed the canceled television series into a global phenomenon. Among the familiar faces returning to the Enterprise was Grace Lee Whitney, once again portraying Janice Rand. But this wasn't the same young yeoman audiences had last seen disappearing from the bridge in 1966. The years had passed within the Star Trek universe as well. Rand had earned a promotion to Chief Petty Officer, serving aboard the newly refitted USS Enterprise under Admiral James T. Kirk. It was a subtle but meaningful acknowledgement that while viewers hadn't seen her journey, the character had continued building a successful Starfleet career. Whitney's return proved so popular that Janice Rand gradually became woven back into the franchise. In Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, she served aboard the USS Excelsior under Captain Hikaru Sulu's predecessor, before later transferring back into Kirk's orbit. In Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, she reunited with the original Enterprise crew during their mission to 20th century San Francisco, once again standing alongside the characters with whom audiences first fell in love. By Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, Rand had risen even further, now serving as a commissioned lieutenant and acting as communications officer aboard the USS Excelsior under Captain Hikaru Sulu. It was an extraordinary transformation. The character, once dismissed after only a handful of episodes, had quietly become one of Starfleet's respected officers. Then came one final surprise. In 1996, nearly 30 years after Janice Rand first appeared on television, Whitney reprised the role once more in Star Trek: Voyager. In the episode Flashback, she appeared through the memories of Lieutenant Tuvok, revisiting the events surrounding Star Trek VI and allowing fans to see Rand one last time alongside Captain Sulu and the Excelsior crew. It was a fitting farewell. The woman who had seemingly vanished without explanation after only 8 aired episodes ultimately portrayed Janice Rand across 5 feature films, 2 television series, and nearly 3 decades of Star Trek history. Ironically, one of the franchise's shortest-lived original characters became one of its longest-lasting. Hollywood, however, deserves only part of the credit for that comeback. The real driving force was the extraordinary loyalty of Star Trek fans. During the 1970s and 1980s, long before comic conventions became global entertainment events, Star Trek gatherings created a unique community where actors could reconnect directly with audiences. Whitney became one of the convention circuit's most beloved guests because of her warmth, vulnerability, and willingness to speak honestly about her life. Whitney fully embraced that renewed connection with the fandom. Together with her husband, Jack Dale, she ventured into one of the more unusual chapters of her career by writing and recording a series of Star Trek-inspired songs. Among them were Disco Trekkin' and Star Child, released during the height of the disco era, along with recordings such as Charlie X, Enemy Within, and USS Enterprise. The songs may seem quirky today, but they reflected something important about Whitney's outlook. Rather than distancing herself from the role that had once brought so much pain, she chose to celebrate it. Then, in 1998, she decided to tell it all. The confessions nobody expected. When Grace Lee Whitney finally decided to tell her life story, many readers expected a familiar Hollywood memoir filled with stories about difficult directors, demanding studios, and the injustices of the entertainment business. Instead, they got something far more surprising. Published in 1998, The Longest Trek: My Tour of the Galaxy was not written as a score-settling autobiography. Whitney certainly described the tragedies that had shaped her life: the assault, the loss of Star Trek, the addiction, and the homelessness. But she refused to present herself as someone who had done nothing wrong. Again and again, she turned the spotlight back on herself, admitting that some of the greatest damage came from her own decisions. That brutal honesty shocked readers. Whitney never denied that she had become consumed by addiction. Looking back after years of sobriety, she admitted that she had lied to people she loved, broken promises, and sabotaged opportunities that others would have considered once-in-a-lifetime chances. She didn't ask readers to excuse those choices because of trauma or bad luck. Instead, she repeatedly emphasized that recovery only begins when a person accepts responsibility for the life they created. Perhaps the most unexpected admissions involved her romantic relationships. Whitney openly acknowledged that while she was still legally married to her second husband, Jack Dale, she had engaged in extramarital affairs. The revelation surprised many fans because she made no attempt to soften or justify it. One of those relationships was with Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 astronaut who had become one of the first two human beings to walk on the moon on July 20th, 1969. At the time, Aldrin was also married to his first wife, Joan Archer. Whitney also admitted to having a relationship with celebrated writer Harlan Ellison, one of the most influential authors in speculative fiction and the Emmy Award-winning screenwriter behind Star Trek's classic episode, The City on the Edge of Forever. Whitney wasn't collecting celebrity names for dramatic effect. She believed that every poor decision, every unhealthy relationship, and every impulsive choice formed part of the larger pattern that addiction had created in her life. She wanted readers to see the complete picture, even when it reflected badly on her. That willingness to reveal uncomfortable truths separated Whitney's memoir from many celebrity autobiographies of its era. But then, she put it all behind her and rebuilt her life from essentially rock bottom. Then, on May 1st, 2015, Whitney died peacefully in her sleep at her home in Coarsegold, California. She was 85 years old. She didn't die as a tragic Hollywood victim. She had reclaimed her life, rebuilt her career, repaired her relationships, and proved that even after unimaginable setbacks, one can write one's own ending. That's a story worth looking at. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.